guilty, that also might spark me to say, I need to change, right? So, you know, in the US, I don't know what it's like here, but in the US, in university culture, students drink a lot of alcohol. It's a big drinking culture. And many students will say, yeah, I was going out a lot, I was drinking a lot, and then I did something bad, right? I slept through an exam, or my parents called one night and I was drunk and I talked to my mom when I had been drinking, or I cheated on my girlfriend because I'd been drinking. Something happens because of their excessive drinking. And we realize it's those times when you feel like I'm guilty, and even more so, I'm ashamed. I'm ashamed for what I did when I was drinking. And Tony and I had the hypothesis that feeling ashamed, in particular shame, for what you've done, might be a really strong motivator inside us to make this change, to say, I don't want to be that kind of person anymore. I need to make a big shift, a real shift. In English, we have this saying, turn over a new leaf. I don't know if that has a parallel in Spanish, but the idea is that I want to, as a plant, I want to grow a new leaf, a completely different, new change, right? Not just improve the way I am now, but actually change. So, while Tony and I were working on these ideas, other researchers as well started to argue that shame doesn't always lead us to just distance from things we've done. Ilona de Hooge and Marcel Zellenberg did a number of nice studies showing that sometimes when we feel ashamed after an academic failure, we're actually motivated to try again. In the intergroup realm, Roberto and other people, including Tony and me, had data showing that sometimes shame is actually linked to support for reparations, so these more pro-social things. So along this time where Tony and I were thinking about this motivation to change the self, other researchers as well were starting to say, hey, shame is not always this bad emotion that just makes us want to keep things secret. It can also motivate us to do more moral things. And in our case, motivation to change who we are. So, what I'm going to tell you about is just a whole series of studies that we have done to try to demonstrate this, to test it, and we're now trying to actually develop interventions, shame interventions, which sounds very counterintuitive if you've read a lot of research on shame, but actually developing interventions that capitalize on people's feelings of shame to motivate them to change, which is a pretty counterintuitive idea based on past research on shame, where usually people have argued, we want to eliminate feelings of shame. Shame is bad. I want you to not feel ashamed. We're saying, at least in the beginning, shame can be the motivator for you to try, right? Okay, so this is one study that we've done. This is actually not published data, but it's data that I think of as the starting point for this. We had 60 participants that we drew from MTurk, so the online sample. And in this study, we did something very simple, which was we just asked each participant to think about a series of different emotions. And for each of these emotions, we just asked them, when you feel angry, when you feel ashamed, when you feel sad, how motivated do you feel, when you feel that emotion, how motivated are you to change something about yourself? Is this motivation to change? We also measured other emotion regulation strategies. This research on emotion regulation. We also assessed things like, do you want to suppress the emotion? That's an avoidance strategy. Do you want to act on the emotion? That's an approach or emotion approach sort of strategy. So we rated both this change the self idea and these emotion regulation strategies. So what we find is when you look at people's reports of how much they say different emotions are linked to wanting to change themselves, what you see is that shame and guilt have very high ratings. I mean, almost on a 1 to 9 scale, they're almost at the very top. But other emotions like fear and anger, sadness, and also anxiety, as well as embarrassment, which is also a self-conscious emotion, have lower ratings of motivation and change. So this was some initial evidence for us that shame and guilt are actually linked to this motivation and change. We also find that when you look at different emotion regulation strategies, we see this very interesting pattern. Blue is avoidance strategies. This is things like try not to think about my emotion, suppress it, avoid it. Whereas approach is things like act on it. We see some real differences. Notice how high shame and to a lesser degree guilt are on avoidance emotion strategies and how low they are on these approach strategies. So we have now a little bit of a paradox here. Shame makes me want to change, but it also makes me want to not think about the fact that I feel really ashamed, right? Yes, I'm completely ashamed that I talked to my mom on the phone when I was drunk. But in fact, I'm even blushing right now, but I don't want to think about it, right? So there's this tension between wanting to change but wanting to avoid. And so this for us is kind of the paradox of shame. That it leads us both to want to change who we are at a fundamental level, but also shame and the things that cause us to feel shame are the things that we most want to keep secret. We want to avoid thinking and feeling. A much more systematic study that we did, which is in a paper that we recently published, we had people in different groups. Some people were called shame experiences, some were called guilt experiences, and some were called embarrassment experiences. And we had people rate their emotions and then what they were motivated to do after the event. So these are not emotion regulation responses, but they're actually, what did you feel motivated to do?
Brian,
yes?
Could you describe more precisely the difference between shame and embarrassment? Because in Spanish,
I feel stupid. It's stupid. So we talked about embarrassment, right? So that there's not necessarily a particular
mistake in public.
Exactly.
You feel
exactly. So embarrassment is more those things where, if I trip and I fall, right? I feel stupid, right? I feel embarrassed. And so again, in different languages, some of these things are marked differently.
You don't distinguish between shame and embarrassment.
So here's my hunch, though. If we actually had the appraisals, we could cleanly differentiate them. So, so there's a really nice set of papers by, I forget his first name, but Brueggemann's, who's a colleague of Marcel Zellenberg's. He has a set of very nice papers where he looks at languages and cultures that do or do not have different words, for self-conscious emotions. And what he finds is even in societies where there's not a different word for the emotion, if you describe the situations and the appraisals that differentiate embarrassment and shame, they're completely separate. And in fact, one of the things that we've been trying to do for a while is actually looking at self-conscious emotions in China. Because Chinese, compared to English, has much more differentiation. So this whole moral shame versus image shame, in Chinese, there's different words. Again, but the idea is that if you actually look at the appraisals and the motivations, you find that there's actually evidence for truly separate emotions, even though the words are not differentiated. Yeah. Okay, so we had items related to repair. I wanted to do something afterwards to make it better. And along with repair goes apology, so repair and apologize. Distancing, I wanted to distance myself as much as possible from the event. I wanted to be completely unassociated with it. And these are things that we had developed in an earlier paper. And then we developed these new items about motivation to change the self. I felt like I needed to change myself after the event. So pretty hopefully has high face validity. We just ask people, what are you motivated to do? So, I don't even know if this is readable, but we did a lot of factor analysis, exploratory, confirmatory factor analysis, and found, in fact, that there's a very nice factor structure differentiating these. So the motivation to change the self is not the same thing as wanting to repair it. Even though you can think about them as both kind of positive things to do, they're very different, actually. There's some points of overlap in terms of some cross loadings, but it's quite minor, actually. And distancing is yet different. We have some other data that's unpublished from India that shows a similar factor structure as well. A little bit more overlap, but good evidence of distinctiveness. We have also then analyzed how these emotions then are linked to motivations. I'm going to move quickly from this complicated diagram, but just to show you that we were using a structural equation modeling approach to this. What we find is that the emotion recall manipulation, that is remembering shame versus remembering guilt versus remembering embarrassment, changes the emotions people report, right? So they're not completely overlapping, right? More importantly, we find that the different emotions uniquely predict different motivations. Guilt predicts motivation to repair and apologize, and also motivation to change. Embarrassment uniquely predicts only distancing, right? And shame predicts change to self and distancing. So actually knowing about motivation to distance from the event helps us actually differentiate these three different self-conscious emotions in a way that we think is deeper than has been shown. So in the second study in this paper that follows the study I just presented, we, because of reviewer B, or editor A actually, there was in the review process, the reviews came back and had a very strong alternative idea to what we had, which is that there was another emotion that the reviewer and the editor thought really mattered, which was regret. And the editor of the journal we were at actually made a really excellent argument for why regret could be accounted for our results. It was very smart. So we ran a study. And we had people recall different emotion experiences. This time it was within subjects. So everybody recalled shame, guilt, regret, and embarrassment experiences. So regret, I mean, in Spanish, yeah. Okay, so emotion ratings and measures to motivations to repair, distance, change the self. Also, we added questions about undoing the past mentally. So there's existing research showing that regret is linked to counterfactual thinking. That is thinking and saying, oh, if only I had done this, things would have turned out. So what did we find? Well, fortunately, we also created what we thought were some more better or more challenging for our hypothesis questions about change the self. So you can think about change, there's lots of ways we could change, right? We wanted to really make it about, what about you in the long run, right? Something about me versus just changing the situation. Changing just my behavior for how I act versus me, myself, who I am, right? And then the past, counterfactual versus the future. So we're just operationalizing this motivation to change in a different way. And hopefully, if we're right, we'll get converging results. So actually, we again use some more complex statistical approaches to test this ideas. I'm going to just kind of break it out into pieces. So we did a very systematic, simultaneous analysis, but I'm just going to show you pieces of it so it's not overwhelming. So what we found is that when we look at these emotions. And embarrassment we were able to rule out right away. It's just not mattering at all, replicating our first study. When we look at shame, guilt, and regret, we again find that shame is uniquely linked to motivation to change. Guilt in this study is not, and regret also is not. A little bit to our surprise, it was actually regret that predicted motivation to repair the present rather than guilt. We didn't set out to study guilt and repair, but it's interesting, there's actually a number of studies showing that when you compare regret and guilt, regret for personal things actually is a pretty good predictor of wanting to repair what you did. Interesting. And as we would expect, it was regret that was really related to this motivation to undo the past, that is these counterfactuals, which again, we should find because other research has really shown. So again, this is another piece of evidence for us that shame really has this link to motivation to wanting to change who we are. So the last study that I'm going to talk about, and then we can discuss things or chat about anything anybody wants to, takes a little bit of a different approach, which is asking the question, if you think back to something that you did earlier in your life, is it completely fixed how you feel about it? Or can I look back at something that I feel bad about and actually think about it in ways that make me feel relatively more ashamed about what I did or relatively more guilty? Okay? So let's say that I lied to my best friend. I could feel really guilty and apologize. I probably also feel really ashamed, right? It's like, oh, I feel so bad, I'm a bad person. I don't want anybody to know that I lied to my best friend, right? So all of these other studies were indicating that there's something particular about shame that seems to motivate us to want to change. So we were trying to think of, well, what's a really hard test of that idea? If we're right about this, what's the kind of evidence that might be really difficult for us to actually find that would help us understand this better? So we developed this technique where we actually get people to reframe, that is to think about past events differently, and to see if we can get people to shift to feel relatively more guilty versus relatively more ashamed for the thing they're remembering. And this is actually a technique that I think could actually be used a lot in different kinds of research. Usually when people study emotions using memory, I will ask people, remember a time when you felt ashamed, or remember a time when you felt guilty, and then we compare those. And we will say, well, the shame event, people feel more ashamed, guilty, people feel more guilty, and that predicts things, right? But there's a real problem actually with this technique that I and other people have done, which is the things I remember when I'm recalling a shame experience might actually be different kinds of real life things than the guilt experiences. So it might not have anything at all to do with emotion. It's just you've asked people to recall different events. What we developed was a technique where we first had people recall a time when they did something that made themselves feel ashamed or guilty. The first phase, they just recall whatever they want. We know it's going to be something related to self-conscious emotions because when you say shame or guilty, you get certain kinds of stories. After they did that, we said, okay, thank you for your story. Now we want you to think about and write about the way in which that past experience makes you feel ashamed. Or, thank you for your story. Now, please write about how that experience makes you feel guilty. So if I write in my story about a time when I lied to my best friend, now we direct the person to now think about how lying to my best friend actually makes me feel ashamed, or how lying to my friend makes me feel guilty. For theoretical and sort of research rigor points of view, this is really important. But we think it's also really important as we start to think about developing interventions. Because if people's memory, emotional memory of what they did in the past is totally fixed, then we might not have a lot of room to work with, right? So we had two questions. A, can we get people to shift their emotions a little bit, right? These aren't going to be huge effects because it's still the same thing, right? It's just the reframing. Can we see shifts in emotion, and does it have any effect on their motivations and their strategies for change? So in terms of measures, I should say we did measure emotions. That was, of course, the first thing we did. I just left that out because I sort of forget. The thing that I really want to tell you about is these new items that we developed, which was these items that tap into people's strategies for changing themselves. And we wanted to think about approach strategies, that is doing new things to turn over a new leaf, versus avoiding doing bad things. So let's say I'm trying to be on a diet, I'm trying to lose weight, right? I can avoid eating bad foods, right? Or I can seek out exercise and good foods. We thought it was possible that we had two possibilities. One is shame will just increase motivation strategies to change overall. Another possibility is that shame might particularly motivate those avoidance strategies, and guilt might motivate the approach ones. So if I feel ashamed, I won't do any more bad things. And whereas if I feel guilty, I'll approach and do positive things. My colleague Ronnie Janoff-Bullman at UMass Amherst, who has done a lot of research on moral reasoning and also shame and guilt, has shown that guilt is more of an approach-related emotion, and shame is more of an avoidance-related emotion. So we had two possibilities here. So, what do we find? Well, we found, first off, pushing people to reframe past events as causing shame versus guilt actually did shift the emotions around, right? It had a weak effect on their overall motivation to change, so it didn't dramatically change, well, how much would I want to change, right? Very general terms. But it actually had even stronger effects on what people said they would do. So these avoidance strategies, I'm going to avoid doing bad things, avoid doing things that would lead me to redo the thing I'm ashamed about or guilty about. Reframing that past experience as having been shameful compared to reframing it as having caused me to feel guilt influences how much I endorse those avoidance strategies. And to a lesser degree, the approach strategies. In fact, when you combine them, in terms of their overall endorsement of, I would try to do these different things to change, taking the same event that made you feel bad about yourself, if you think about that event in terms of how it made you feel ashamed, rather than feeling guilty, you endorse more change strategies, that you're more motivated to avoid doing bad things and also to try doing good things. So these aren't huge effects, but I think they're actually really compelling to me because we take the exact same event. This is simply the effect of rethinking a little bit more about the story you just wrote about, and now thinking about it as making you feel ashamed versus guilty. And just doing that is enough to move, again, not huge, but meaningfully shift how people, what people say that they will do. So we've been struggling. I have lots of other data that's messy, and I don't know whether it's good data or bad data. We've been really trying to actually just look at people's behavior in the lab. And it's very much a glass half full thing. Every study we do, we find things that we were hoping to find and then things that are challenging. So we're still in the midst of trying to turn this from a basic study on emotion processes, where I now feel very confident that shame is linked to a motivation to change ourselves. I feel very confident in that. Now what we're trying to do is to trying to take the next step to see if we can actually turn this into some kind of useful intervention. And what we think, or what I think in particular, is that what I think that shame is particularly good at doing is shining a moral spotlight on ourselves and getting us to start trying to change. I think that if you continue to feel ashamed about yourself as you're trying to change, I think it probably is actually bad. But I think that that spark, that realization that I'm not a totally good person, which usually we don't want to think about, right? It's like, this was bad. I was bad. I have to admit that I was not a good person, or that I'm not meeting the ideal that I want to have. So what am I going to do? Am I going to just keep it secret? Maybe, right? Because shame makes us want to keep stuff secret. But maybe also I want to change, and maybe this is the time when it's going to happen. So people's motivation to change themselves is something that I think would be really interesting to learn more about. What sparks people to want to make change? We don't actually know a lot about that. Right? I think college is a really interesting time because I think it's a time when us as young people move into an environment where we have a lot of freedom. And I think we discover a lot of things about ourselves, some good things, and it's also a time where we discover weaknesses about ourselves. Right? We don't have that parent saying to us, don't do that. We maybe have to reach in full adulthood that ability to have that internal monitor. And we now know that motivation to change self is actually really meaningfully different from other motivations that are linked to self-conscious emotions. It's not just repairing the situation. It's not counterfactuals. And ironically, motivation to change self is often very highly correlated with wanting to distance from the event. It's this push and pull, what my colleague Tony calls the paradox of shame. So again, I think we've really now shown, compared to guilt, embarrassment, regret, other basic emotions, shame, from everything we've been able to find, is the emotion that's most linked to this desire to change who we are. And I think, like I said, I'm most excited about our finding that we can actually, to some degree, actually show that people can reframe these experiences in ways that are relatively more shaded towards guilt versus shame, and that actually matters. But again, I think it's important to remember for all of us that shame is linked to this desire to avoid and suppress the emotion. Quite a number of researchers have said that shame is the emotion that we least want to experience. So it's a very negative thing that people, for the most part, don't want to feel. All right, so I want to thank you. My collaborators, particularly Tony Schmader, who's a professor at University of British Columbia, and my newest student who works in my lab, Dan Chapman, who is fantastic, and I hope will be coming to Chile for lots of topics, but certainly this work as well. So I think, yeah, there we go. Thank you so much. So.
Ok, abrimos la discusión, preguntas, quieran comentar. No les dé vergüenza.
Yes.
You related shame with motivation to change yourself, right?
Yes.
But you also said that when you try to change yourself and you're still shame, it's a bad thing, right?
We think that that's true. So if you look at the clinical psychology literature on shame, there's much research and actually lots of more applied therapeutic writing that when you're in therapy, for example, and someone's reporting that they feel very ashamed about some aspect of themselves, that it's a bad thing. And that actually the first step is to get people to not feel so ashamed about themselves. I actually think that that's true. But that's after you felt ashamed about yourself for a long time. So if I, have some past experience that I feel bad about, and I still feel ashamed about it, but I haven't made any effort to change, keeping feeling ashamed is just going to make me feel worse and worse. What we think, we don't have any evidence for this, but our hypothesis is that what shame is good at, what its best function is to get us to start to change. So if I lie to a friend, or I cheat on an exam, or I get drunk, right? And I do something bad. Well, why don't I just keep doing that, right? Get drunk again and again, keep lying again and again, keep cheating again and again. What we think is that it's when you actually have that shame feeling that it stops you, and you say, oh, I don't ever want to do this ever again, right? And that if at that point you do actually start to change who you are, your shame feelings will go away. Because I don't feel good about it, but I'm not that person anymore. I'm not going to do that ever again. And so shame in the beginning can get us to change, but if we don't do that and it still lingers, then we feel bad. There are also things that we feel ashamed about that actually are not things that we can change, and in fact are things that are not our fault. And if you feel ashamed for things like having been abused, right, which people who have suffered abuse often feel ashamed about themselves. In that context, it's not you that was bad, right? You actually didn't do anything wrong. And so in that case, feeling ashamed is actually not a good thing. So shame can be very maladaptive, but we think that it is a good thing to feel for getting us to turn over a new moral direction. Yeah. Is that helpful?
Yeah, because I was relating what you said with eating disorders that are really related to subconscious emotions and to shame.
Right. And I think that's a case where, that's a case where I think the degree of shame and the fact that I think it is tied into beliefs about the self that are actually inaccurate, then I think it can be very dysfunctional, right? So that's a case where, again, from a therapeutic point of view, it needs to be an intervention to have more accurate self-views as actually being worthy and healthy and attractive, that then would eliminate that shame, right? So shame is a very powerful emotion, and again, if you're feeling it is very aversive, but it isn't always bad, right? we know all of the things as psychologists. We know, I think, a lot of the places where shame can be very maladaptive. And we're not necessarily arguing against any of that. We're just saying sometimes it's a good thing. Right? Hey, yes?
I'm thinking about the difference that shame drives in people. Some people hide.
Yeah.
Some other people do something about it. I'm thinking why is the difference if you look at it, and what is the thing that makes people do one behavior to the other?
Mm-hmm.
And if it could have something to do with conflicting the image of self that we have, maybe they identify I am not a liar. And then they finally see themselves lying, and then it's no, I'm not that person. I have to do something to change that. Or maybe it's I am a liar. I always lie. I feel ashamed, but I am this kind of guy, so there's nothing to do wrong.
So we know from our data that correlationally, people who are higher in self-esteem report lower feelings of shame. So again, take that for what you will. But we found that in multiple studies.
Higher self-esteem?
Lower shame. Oh, I'm a good person. Interestingly, though, there's a line of research that Juliana Brines and Serena Chen have done on self-compassion. Self-compassion is the idea that I have compassion for me. So let's say you did a bad thing and you're feeling terrible about yourself. I might come to you and I might say, look, everyone makes mistakes. You know, I'm still your friend. This doesn't mean you're horrible, right? That's other directed compassion. They've been studying self-directed compassion, and it's not the same as having self-esteem. When you have self-compassion, you acknowledge fully that what you did was wrong, or that you have faults. But you still have a sense of love and support of yourself. Sounds a little bit weird, but they find very good evidence for it, that we all differ in the extent to which we're critical and harsh towards ourselves versus compassionate towards ourselves. And they have a very nice study that shows that after moral lapses, when you have people think about times when they committed moral wrongdoing, people who are higher in self-compassion report more motivation to change themselves. So I think we kind of go back to this question of, well, who does it? I think there are ways that we construe ourselves that do affect the extent to which shame leads to good outcomes versus getting trapped and just feeling terrible and ashamed about ourselves versus ignoring it, right? And I think the ideal situation is to have very high self-compassion, but actually only moderate levels of self-esteem. And I think the people who get trapped are the people who both have low self-esteem and they also have low compassion. It's like, yeah, I'm not a very good person, and I hate myself for that, and I should be different, right? So again, we've been in our new studies, we're including these measures of self-compassion to examine it as a moderator, and it hasn't worked as cleanly as we thought it would, and it may, again, sometimes it just takes a while to figure out how to study it, but that's how we're approaching this thing.
Dario, preguntas.
In the same way of the question Michelle did before, there might not be something more basic about the shame thing about doing something about myself and just hiding about it.
Yeah.
It could not be about the personality of the person. I don't know, some personality trait or something like that.
It could be, and I think, so this is where I think thinking about different research designs can be really helpful. We often do studies where we have different groups of people recall different emotions. So one group recalls shame, one recalls guilt, and so forth. And that we have this problem where they could be recalling different events. Right? We also have a problem that we often have people with different personalities. Right? So in the studies that I presented today, we have actually three different approaches. One is the method where one group reports shame, another guilt, and so forth. Right? We also have studies where the same person reports shame, guilt, regret, embarrassment. Or in the first study, anger, sadness, and so forth. So now it's you recalling all those different emotions. Right? Remember that very first slide I presented? That was within subjects. And then also the last study that I presented, where everyone first recalls the experience, right? So you might be somebody who just tends to recall more shame things, right? And I tend to recall more guilt things. But that's only the first phase of the study. Now we have a true experimental manipulation, where some people are assigned to think about their story in terms of how it makes them feel guilty, and now some are assigned to think about it in terms of how they feel ashamed. There's now no longer any confound between the emotion and the event, because the event happens first. So, the problem is it's weak. The reality is a lot of the effect that we get in the normal, I'll call it the normal study because it's the one that always works the best. It is easier for us when we actually do have that confound, where you recall shame and you recall guilt, we get big effects. relative. So part of it could be the situations are different, and definitely there are differences between people. But I think with the designs that we have, we can rule out that it's personality that's driving these effects. Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking about I think about moral and how some theories say that it's more gut feeling things like moral, and then
Yes.
some others say it's like cognitive thing.
Right.
So I was thinking that maybe, I don't know, shame could lead to some cognitive questioning, while the other emotions look more gut.
They could, yeah.
Just you feel things, and then the other thing makes you question it.
Right. So, I mean, I've been thinking about these different perspectives on moral development, and there's quite a number of papers that have looked, for example, in college, how taking different kind of classes leads college students to think more in more sophisticated ways about morality. My belief is that how we most learn about morality is by making mistakes. I mean, things that we should not have done. That when it comes to our actual behavior, that we have ideals, right? We have habits and things we learn as we're growing up. But I don't think they really completely get connected to how we actually behave until we actually make a mistake. And then we do something that we actually feel bad about. That, I think, is what connects our morality with ourselves, right? And I think it does actually go back to childhood. I think we actually do develop that in childhood as well. I don't think that how we learn about morality, I think, is related to when we make moral lapses, how do our parents treat us, right? So I don't think it's mainly a thinking thing. I think it's connecting up ideals with behavior linked by emotion, where you say to yourself, I'm never going to do that ever again. Not because I got punished, but because I do not want to be that person, right? And we don't want to be hypocrites, right? Spanish? Yeah. So that to me is what it's about, is that shame, if we act on it to change, is the thing that prevents us from performance. And then there are people who don't feel shame. And sometimes people who don't feel any shame and treat people badly, if you ask them what their values are, sometimes they have all these values. And then you say, well, why don't you behave that way? It's because I think they don't link up their emotions to their own behavior. Yeah?
Do you use build instrument, I know, to measure self-conscious emotion if the self-conscious affect test?
The Tosca, yes.
Did you use the Tosca here, or did you use another instrument to measure it?
Yeah, so June Tangi, who is one of the main developers of that, we corresponded a lot about research, and she actually has, so I'm going to get to the Tosca, but I want to tell you about some of June's data. She's a great person, I really like her a lot, and she's actually been doing a very long-term study of people who are in jail, so people who are incarcerated, right? And for a whole bunch of reasons, studying their emotions and how they think about the things they did in the past that were wrong and so forth. And so two things that are really interesting from her research. One is we often think that people who are criminals actually are people who just don't feel shame and guilt. This whole idea of psychopathy, right?
Yeah.
It's like, she finds that when you actually give people who are in jail for serious crimes these scales, it's about, in the US, where we have a huge number of people incarcerated, it's only about 10% of people who are in jail who actually fit this quote-unquote psychopathic profile. In fact, most people who are in jail are actually very shame-prone. and they're in the shame that's the stuck, I just feel bad about myself. The low self-esteem, low self-compassion people. And a lot of why they're in jail, she thinks, is actually related to self-medication. So what's a great way to not think about what a bad person you are? Why don't you do some drugs that help you dissociate from yourself? And then maybe you need to rob a house because you have a drug habit. Right? She also has another new study, though, showing that people who get out of jail, that you can predict whether they go back to jail based on how much they feel ashamed and guilty for the thing they were originally convicted for, in exactly the way that we would predict as well. That is, if you feel ashamed or guilty for your original crime, recidivism rates are lower. They're actually behaviorally doing this change the self, we think. So all that's just to say, with June tagging, we've had a lot of dialogue. We actually have a rough version of a revised Tosca scale that now includes change the self as one of the components of it. So I really love June a lot, so I'm going to be critical of her, but it's just not her, it's the Tosca. When you actually look at the Tosca and how shame and guilt are actually assessed, most of the things that people answer are motivations. If I skipped out on lunch with a friend, what would I do? And then there's a series of things like apologize and so forth. Or I would try to not think about it. And if you circle, I try to not think about it, she counts that as shame. But it's actually a measure of distancing. And so again, the Tosca, to some degree as an instrument, reflects an assumption in the field that repair equals guilt and distancing equals shame. So we have used the Tosca, and we do find that it is weakly related to the emotions people report and to their motivation, but not always in the way you would anticipate. Because the Tosca, when you actually look at it, is a measure of motivation more than really the emotion. Yeah. Yeah?
So I have a question. Is there any evidence or research that look at whether there's a difference in frequency in everyday conversation in the use of guilt or shame? When you talk about yourself or others? I mean, I feel guilt, you feel guilt. I feel shame, you feel shame. You create that 2x2 table with different difference. Because I'm still struggling trying to see a difference.
So
maybe that might.
So there is a paper, and I'm not remembering the name of the author. There is a one of these cell phone text beeper studies, right, where you send people texts and you have very short things where you say, what emotion are you feeling right now, and what are you motivated to do? That actually linked feelings of guilt to sort of behavior change. They didn't actually assess in that study feelings of change. So they only asked about guilt along with other emotions. So I don't know of any good studies that give us a frequency in terms of daily experience. I mean, I think it's a completely good question, and maybe it's something that we should ourselves think about doing. So I don't have an answer to it. We know from our studies that people don't, so again, some unpublished data. If we ask regular like undergraduates to explain how shame and guilt and embarrassment are different, some people can do a pretty good job of coming up with what we as researchers think the differences are, but sometimes they're all over the place. And some people just say, I don't know. But we ask people, recall a time when you felt ashamed. No one is like, oh, I don't know, like, what do you mean? I can't think of anything. Everybody's like, oh, yeah. And the same with guilt. So they're not hard experiences for people to come up with. People don't really want to do it, and we are usually very careful to run people one at a time. For example, like, we never do a study where 12 people come in to the lab and everyone's at a table writing about their worst shame experiences. So we try to do things to make it feel like a comfortable environment for them, but the stories that we get could, I was going to say, we've done analysis of people's actual stories as well, but they're very compelling stories. I mean, people do bad things and they feel really terrible about it. And they are willing to tell us about it. So I don't think that the intense feelings of shame are very frequent for most people. I think what happens a lot is we almost do things, and then we're like, I better not, right? Or I will quickly fix it, right? And it's only every once in a while that we really, really have an intense shame experience. But I think that's true for other emotions, like guilt. Or even things like fear. I mean, I haven't felt intense fear for a year or two, right? Intense fear, very infrequent. A little nervous, anxious, bored, a little worried, but intense emotions are in general, I think, pretty. But I agree with you. It would be good for us to have a better idea of that.
Yeah, I mean, the other one, I think you have done it the other way. Instead of asking people about they tell you what's the event.
Yes.
And they feel guilt or shame. You present a story, you ask them.
We have done
what they would.
We've done some, we call them imagine things. So imagine you did this. And we get conversion evidence for those things as well. In fact, we're doing, with some of the new studies, we're doing studies where we change the vignette, the story, and see if we can get people to report that if they were in that situation, would they change more or less? We've been particularly interested in the difference between moral failures versus performance failures. Like I fail an exam versus I lie. So we're going to use some vignette, imagine situations to study that as well. We feel a little bit more comfortable about the recall experiences rather than the imagine ones because we're a little bit concerned about how people actually construct these emotions in imagining them, but we have used it. Yeah.
I don't know if I understood this correctly, but I was wondering, you said like you were asking to undergraduates.
In some studies, yes. Some is undergrads and then some is mixed adult populations with MTurk. Yeah.
Okay, so I was wondering if you feel there's a relation maybe between the fact that they're undergraduates, who are young students sometimes, and they're in social behavior normally, so pairs are very important.
Right.
So the importance of shame, for example, on the 10th population, could be related with the age of the people who participate.
Yeah, I mean, so we don't know, we have not systematically studied how the nature of people's shame experiences and how they cope with or deal with shame changes as people grow older. And I think it's a really interesting question. I think that self-conscious emotions, because they are introspective, that they may be the kind of emotions that we actually need to have some skill and experience in life experiencing in order to deal with them most appropriately. As opposed to like fear, maybe you get better at it as you get older, but I agree with your hunch, your instinct that development through adulthood is actually really important, and we don't know anything systematic. We know it's not. We know that what we found isn't unique to just college students or older adults because we have studied both populations, but we haven't compared them or developed any theory for how this should evolve developmentally. But I think it's very important.
¿Más preguntas o comentarios?
Oh, okay.
I was really interested in the regret issue.
Hmm?
I always imagine regret feelings as a consequence of it.
Yes.
So I would imagine myself doing something wrong. My regret feeling would come out after I feel guilt.
Absolutely. I agree.
So sitting on your model,
Yeah.
I immediately thought about guilt
Right.
mediated by regret to regret,
Right.
rather than a competing
Right.
predictor.
Right.
Because regret was the only one predicting
Yeah.
in
Yes.
the model.
Right.
So,
For reparations. Yeah.
exactly. So
Yeah.
I wonder if you bring it as a mediator,
Right.
because if you feel guilt,
Right.
they activate your regret feelings.
Right.
Through that mechanism,
Right.
you may end up regret.
Right.
Maybe they are overlapping too, because those emotions, as we know,
Yeah.
maybe researching
Right.
guilt and shame or regret are quite heavily related to each other. So I think it's interesting to
Yeah.
we face similar problem with empathy and guilt,
Yeah. Yeah.
because how could you feel ready to recur?
Right.
We rationalize thinking, feel guilty,
Yeah.
increase your empathy for the victim, and then you're willing to recur. What would you say to the other way around? Empathy,
Right.
because you sympathize with the victim,
Right.
you just feel more guilty for the things you've done,
Right.
and then you're willing to recur.
Right.
So
So,
that regret relationship
Yeah.
is something.
so a study that we're thinking about doing, which we may try to run next year, is to have college students, and they're all going to be University of Massachusetts students, and we're going to recruit people who are juniors, so they've been in college for a little while, and they're going to be in college for a little while, right? And we're going to ask them about something that has happened in the last year while they were students at UMass, that happened at UMass, that they feel ashamed or guilty about. So we're really going to pin them down to something recent, something that's related to living on campus and being a student, and we're going to ask them our standard questions about, well, how does it make you feel? What are you motivated to do? But then we're going to come back to them again later, and we're going to see, have they done anything, right? Have they stopped drinking, right? Have they changed their study habits and so forth? And then we're going to ask them, well, when you think about what you did in the past, how does it make you feel? And how do you feel right now? I think that may be a thing where we could actually, over time, see, does regret... My belief is that shame and regret grow over time when people are not able, either because of themselves or because of the situation, to change or fix what they've done. And that you really regret things that just can't be undone. And also about yourself, if I can't change, that it is bad, that shame, what do I do? Again, I think then it's avoidance, right? Or self-compassion, and you just accept that I am not perfect, right? So I think with these cross-sectional designs, I don't necessarily trust the mediation, but I think that you're right. Theoretically, I completely agree with you, and I just think we need to actually follow people, right? And it kind of goes back to your question, like how common is this, right? Yeah.
And the second question is, have you ever considered other factors predicting change or avoiding change?
Yeah.
Because for us, for many years, we've been researching on this shameful feeling regarding the past.
Right.
So maybe people really experience change because of damage the group did to
Yeah.
left leader
Right.
class.
Right.
But there were other superior points that they really address.
Right.
Even they experience shameful feelings.
Yeah.
We did it for country and
Yeah.
we found kind of rationalization
Right.
to justify what they've done, even though they feel very ashamed.
Right.
They're not willing to change. So it could be factors restricting change, even though the shameful feeling may drive or change motivation.
Right.
And the other factor produces the opposite effect. When you have moral goals and you justify this
Right.
sense of thinking about behavior that you be involved because you want it, or
Right.
the group want it.
Absolutely.
And you regret things because it was important.
Right. I mean, I think that to some degree that often goes back to the ability to make changes. So it's interesting that in the research on post-traumatic stress disorder, so PTSD, that there's a lot of new work that's arguing that PTSD, as we've thought about it as a clinical condition, is actually separable into two actually distinct things. One is actually a true fear-based conditioning, when you face these near-death experiences and you have this strong conditioned fear response. But there's tons of research going back many decades showing that people who are diagnosed with PTSD often report feeling a lot of guilt and shame for the thing that is linked to PTSD. In particular, for example, combat veterans, right? So there's now a new line of research and way of thinking about this that people who study combat veterans have been talking about that they refer to as moral injury. That a consequence of engaging in violent conflict is that you see and do bad things. War is a highly moralized situation, and that you have to be loyal to your team. You are surrounded by terrible things. You have to kill people often. And that when you're in a combat situation, these overriding concerns of survival and your team and your mission basically allow you to do all of these things and to get through them. But then what happens is when you come back to civilian life, now you look back and now you're in this situation where killing people or seeing dead bodies is morally just abhorrent and bizarre. And there's a disconnect between the memories of the things that they saw and did when they were in wartime and now their current life. I'm working on a paper that's under review with some people at RAND, actually, who have a large study of Cambodian Americans who came to the United States after being refugees from the Cambodian genocide. And folks in this population have extremely high rates of PTSD and depression. So reaching clinical cutoff levels for PTSD and depression of over 50% of the sample. It's incredibly high. And we developed a measure of, we didn't call it moral injury at the time because we created these items before this whole movement around moral injury started in the PTSD literature. But it's basically questions about feeling ashamed for things that you had to do to survive, feeling guilty about abandoning your family or not protecting people, feeling humiliation because of things you were forced to do, like forced labor and so forth. And we find, and there's nothing that can be done, that there's no way you can't go back and change. There's nothing about you that can be changed. But we find that people do endorse these things, that they feel ashamed and guilty and dishonored for their experiences. And we find that that actually uniquely predicts their severity of PTSD above and beyond the actual count of the traumas that they experience. So controlling for traumatic experiences, these, what we're now calling these moral injury items, which to me, they're shame, a lot of them are shame items, predicts PTSD severity. So I think when it comes back to these things of, well, moral insight, it's not always a good thing for oneself, because if I can't do anything about it, I can get stuck in this situation where I just feel like a morally dishonorable person, and there's nothing that can be done, right? I think that's part of the art of post-conflict reconciliation, is giving people who are combatants in the conflict a narrative that allows them to simultaneously recognize the immorality of what was done, but again, at kind of a collective level, giving this compassion, right? In South Africa, in their Truth and Reconciliation Commission, there's this idea of Ubuntu, which is humanness, that out of the reconciliation process, there had to be this idea that we're all whites and blacks together, we're all humans. This idea of humanness transcends whatever happened during the conflict. And I think the idea behind it was for whites, like if whites were kept in the position as the perpetual perpetrator, how are you going to ever really build a healthy multiracial society? So Desmond Tutu and the other people who were really the thought and moral sort of leaders behind the black sort of strategy for how to build a new South Africa, I think they totally got that. You can't have part of your society forever feeling ashamed for itself. Anyway, that's mine.
Any other comments, questions?
Great.
Right,
Thank you so much. Yeah. And thank you, Roberto, for the computer. I don't know what is going on.
¿Todos ustedes están en el curso de doctorado? Vamos a darlo, mire, son casi las 3:30. Si tenemos unos 10 minutos, para que tomen un poco aire, estamos en la sala. Estamos en la sala ya en la raíz. Ya. Pero alguna que está ahí.
Mira, eso.
Yes. Yeah. I think it depends what you learn about yourself.
Well,